today I'm going to talk about something called the levels of consciousness. And it's really about how to make sense of this crazy world and grow yourself in the process. Now, when I talk about the crazy world, what am I referring to? Here are some of the things that really puzzle me or bother me. So, for example, how do I make sense of COVID? Or how do I make sense of Donald Trump and Trumpism, particularly after the ridiculous things that have happened this week actually? How do we make sense of ideologies, all the isms, and all the conflicts that we see around us? How to make sense of money, greed, poverty, inequality? How to make sense of the climate crisis? And I invite you to add your own. So I believe that this framework that I'm going to present might be a lens for you to think about. Now, we could take any of these issues and we could easily take the view that just ascribe it to the fact that humans are dumb. Or as Dogmatics, the character from the Asterix comic says, these humans are crazy. Or even the great Albert Einstein said, only two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe. But today I don't want to take this view. I want to believe that human beings are much more intelligent than this. But we perhaps need a framework that might help us to make sense of all the craziness. So my belief is that reframing the craziness may help us to see it afresh and to see it differently. And I would like to propose that the way to reframe is to look at reality around us through the lens of consciousness. Our belief is that every problem is at least partially a problem of consciousness, and that every solution requires at least partially raising or evolving our consciousness. Again, the great Albert Einstein said that a problem can't be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And so if we use consciousness as a lens, if we can see issues as problems of consciousness and we can learn how to raise or evolve our own consciousness, perhaps this may be a helpful framework for all of you. Now, we are going to use the word consciousness many, many times in today's session, so it will probably help if I try to define it, because it's not an easy concept to define. So what is consciousness? If you look at the dictionary, you will see a definition that looks something like this. Consciousness is a mental state of awareness, perception, and responsiveness to oneself and one's surroundings. This is a good definition, but I don't believe that this is an adequate definition in terms of really understanding consciousness at its core. So we prefer to use this definition and this explanation, that consciousness is the inmost and the primal material of all existence. That the one and the same consciousness exists behind the reality that we perceive. That this consciousness unites and sustains everyone and everything at the deepest level. That this consciousness is not static or fixed, but dynamic and constantly evolving. And I will explain more about this. And that this consciousness is both subjective, which means it can be experienced internally, and also objective. That means it can be worked upon and developed. In other words, unlike the dictionary definition, which says we have consciousness, we don't believe that. We believe that we don't only have consciousness, we believe that we are consciousness manifest in our human form. So you might describe our definition as perhaps a little more spiritual in that nature. Let me talk a little bit about the evolutionary impulse. Thanks to people like Charles Darwin, uh, there is quite a lot of shared knowledge and understanding about the biological aspect of evolution. We know, for example, that cells have evolved from simple to extremely complex. We know that systems have evolved from independent to dependent to interdependent. We know that organisms need to adapt to survive. In other words, they need to respond to problems and threats, and they need to learn from their own responses and become better and better at it as life progresses. We also know that evolution is a holarchy, it's not a hierarchy. For example, we know that when the human embryo develops inside its mother's womb, it first looks like just a cell. Then it looks like a smaller organism, a more complex organism. Then it starts to look like a fish, and then it starts to look like a mammal, and then it starts to look like a primate, and then it starts to look like a human being. So we know that evolution is deeply wired and is part of the entire process within us biologically. The question is, what about psychological, social, or spiritual evolution? And unfortunately, this is not a topic that is uh, discussed in public forums. There may be some experts who know this, but not all of us. So I'm trying to actually address that issue in today's presentation. I'm very happy, though, that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I will just let you read some of these names. Some will be familiar to you, others may not be familiar to you. There is a lot of amazing work that has been done on this topic. And because of the amazing work that all these people have done, I feel very confident today to sit here before you and present my thoughts on this somewhat tricky subject. Let me present a couple of caveats. The first is that all of us have all levels of consciousness within us. So as I present the different levels, I invite you to actually ask yourself and reflect and see how you address or how you are aware of that consciousness, level of consciousness within you. But it's also true that for each one of us, the center of gravity may differ. Somebody may generally operate from a higher level of consciousness, somebody may generally operate from a lower level of consciousness and move up and down in the process. So we move up and down the levels in different situations. And many times on the same day, we may operate from multiple levels of consciousness at different times. The important thing to remember is that stress pulls us down the levels and presence pulls us up. We'll talk about this a little bit later. The second caveat is that it's only a framework. So let's hold it lightly. This framework explains many things, but it may not explain everything. So I invite you to use it to understand what's going on around us and understand yourself better, but not to judge or to stereotype. Then this presentation and this framework would be misused rather than properly used. And finally, I would say, if you don't find it useful or if you don't find any part of it useful, please feel free to drop it. It's entirely up to you to decide what is useful, what is valuable, and keep it. Another favorite quote from one of my heroes, who is Charlie Chaplin, he says, "If you can't see life as absurd or amusing, you're in trouble." So keeping these caveats in mind, let's proceed. Let me summarize on this chart and then I will explain each of the levels in some detail. So first of all, as I said before, consciousness evolves in distinct stages. And I've presented this inverted triangle to depict what I mean. So the first stage is called the I stage. It's also the egocentric stage. Now, for the moment, just ignore these other words. I'm going to explain each one of them. Just focus on the various levels themselves. The second stage is called the us and them level or the ethnocentric level. From the ethnocentric level emerges the it or the scientific level, which may be described as rational or objective or secular. And from the it level of consciousness emerges the fourth level, which is the we or the pluralistic level, which you can describe as multicultural, inclusive, or even planetary. And finally, from the we emerges the one level of consciousness or the unitive level of consciousness, which can be described as integral or universal or boundaryless. Now, one of the things to note is that at the lowest level of consciousness, at the level of I, there is a certain tight, constricted, contracted awareness. It's like being tightly bound by ropes. Whereas at the highest level of consciousness, at the unitive or the one level of consciousness, there is a kind of an expanded awareness. It's a bigger, more expansive, freer kind of an awareness. And this has been described by many people, so I'm just pointing that out to you. The other interesting thing is that, as I said, the higher level of consciousness emerges from the lower. And how does that happen? It is because of the challenges that one faces at one level of consciousness requires us to adapt and evolve to a higher level of consciousness to be able to deal with those problems. This is what Einstein meant in his favorite quote, in his famous quote. So it is the challenges that we face that create a higher level of consciousness. So it puts our challenges and suffering and our problems and our traumas into perspective because they serve us by impelling us to evolve. I hope that makes sense. Let me now dive into each level of consciousness, and I'm going to show you a few visuals so that you get a feeling for the flavor and the energy of this consciousness. And as I go through each one of them, I invite you to also reflect and see what do you find of this consciousness in yourself. So the I or the egocentric level, for example, you can see this in these scavenger boys who are really hunting for scraps to survive today. Right? They are living on the margins of society, focused only on their daily survival. And therefore, it is only natural that they will be operating from this I or egocentric level of consciousness. But it's not just the scavengers who can operate this way. Even the most powerful man in the world, who's currently making a real spectacle of himself, I would argue, is also operating from the same I or egocentric level of awareness. Similarly, if you look at the stock market, which is really powered or motivated by personal greed to become richer and richer and richer, is also, in my view, impelled by or motivated by the same level of consciousness. Now, what does it mean? Let me explain a bit further. Every level of consciousness has its worldview. And so what I'm going to start with as I describe each one is to tell you what the worldview is. So the worldview of the I level is that life is hostile and dangerous, and I must stay alive today. This is where the scavenger boys come in. Now, in this level, The primary allegiance is to oneself. At this level, I am unaware or unconcerned about anybody else. I am the only one that matters. My survival is the only thing that matters. So these basic survival needs, or values if you want to call them, or beliefs if you want to call them, they can either be healthy. For example, at this level, you might say that my need is to live safely, to mate, and to procreate, which is a kind of an animal level of consciousness, but perfectly healthy. Or it can become a very unhealthy type of a consciousness, which is egoistic or narcissistic or self serving, which is perhaps what we are seeing in Donald Trump today, and which is why we are watching him with this kind of vicarious horror, because in a way he represents things that we know also exist within us. Now, examples: infants, as you know, in their very early days are very I oriented, or adults who may regress to that stage through illness or injury. If somebody has a terrible brain injury, they may regress to this level. As I said, people who live on the fringes of society may be at this level, or the stock market is another example of this. So I hope you're getting a sense of what this level means and that you can identify it and be aware of it and accept it in yourself as well. The second level of consciousness is called the us and them level, also the ethnocentric level. And so this is a consciousness that we have seen historically in the tribal community. We have seen it in the military. The entire military is organized around the protection of one nation's sovereignty against attack from another nation. And therefore, the us and them consciousness is very natural in this context. Or, for example, when you see the New Zealand rugby team do the haka, where they are drawing upon the Maori tribe and their culture and rituals, and they are using that to pump themselves up competitively so that they can win against their opponents. This is another example of the us and them consciousness. Excuse me. So, what is the worldview here? The worldview is that life is mysterious, threatening, and spirit controlled. At this level, there is safety in numbers. I support the group, and in return, the group supports me. The primary allegiance now is not to the self, but to the family or the tribe or to the clan or to the norms or to the traditions. And in order to demarcate the us and them, the culture creates and conforms to clearly marked insider outsider boundaries. So, this, as you know, can take many, many forms, whether it's a uniform or whether it's a ritual or whether it's a mark, which is, this mark or this mark or that mark. These are all symbols of an us and them inside outside boundaries, that if you don't have this particular thing or a badge that you wear around your neck, you can't enter this place. So this is a kind of a boundary delineation. When you look at what does this level contribute and what are the values that this level upholds, the healthy values are things like honor, sacrifice, dignity, loyalty, and belonging. Whereas the unhealthy values are things like being territorial or ritualistic or intolerant or amoral and even violent. Again, when you start to see us and them at work, you will notice how this level flits between these healthy and unhealthy values. What are some examples of this? All command and control hierarchies are examples of this. The monarchy, for example, the military, as I mentioned, the partisan sports fans. You know how people wear the scarf or the jersey, or there is the section where the away fans are, there is a section where the home fans are, where there is a tremendous amount of banter and back and forth between them. All the social and cultural groups, And then it becomes unhealthy in terms of cults and gangs and fundamentalist groups, or even systems like slavery or caste or anti Semitism are all examples of us and them consciousness. Even smaller things like, say, office politics and factions, in my view, sometimes represent this level of consciousness rather than a healthier level of consciousness. So I hope this gives you a sense of how us and them differs from I. And again, I invite you to reflect so that you can be aware of this consciousness that exists inside you as well. The third level of consciousness is called it, or the scientific level. And there are many, many examples of this. Let me just present them all to you one by one, whether it's the wheel or the telescope that allowed us to look at our place in the planet, or the apple falling on Isaac Newton's head, or Copernicus realizing that the world is round, or the discovery of electricity, or the atom, or the DNA molecule. This is a completely different level which has emerged from that us and them consciousness as we have grown and as we have evolved as a species. And therefore, the worldview of this level is that life is governed by universal, observable, and predictable laws. In other words, this level believes strongly that there is an essential similarity between all of us. That if you cut me, or if you cut you, or if you cut another person, we will all bleed and we will all bleed red. And so, therefore, there is a fundamental belief that there is an equal impact of natural and human processes on us. And as a result of this worldview, reason is given more prominence over myth, proof is given more prominence over intuition, and a secular approach is given more prominence over the denominational approach, which usually comes from a us and them level. Now, when we look at the contribution and values of this level, again, when it is healthy, this level really values objective truths, the idea of exploration and innovation, individual autonomy, liberty, progress. And I'm sure you will start to recognize these patterns in the things that are going on around you. But when the same level of consciousness starts to become unhealthy in its contribution and values, then you start to see some of these things: a disconnect with nature, emotion, and myth, a kind of a mechanistic or materialistic mindset, a very competitive and an exploitative mindset. These are all the unhealthy dimensions of the it level or the scientific level. And when you think about examples, they are pretty obvious, right? The whole scientific method, the desire for proof and evidence in everything. A Silicon Valley, for example, is an industry that is entirely built up around this level of consciousness, and in a way is dominating our mainstream discourse and our lives today. The political system of democratic capitalism, for example, comes from this. Most corporations, the whole world of academia, the military industrial complex is all organized around this it level of consciousness. So, once again, let me invite you to reflect on the differences between I, us and them, and it. And also, if you are able to reflect and discover this it level of consciousness within yourself and within people around you and surroundings. I hope this is helpful so far. Let's keep moving on. Remember, we are rising and evolving, and our awareness is expanding as we rise and evolve. The V level is also called the pluralistic level. And the worldview here is bigger, more inclusive, more expansive than the previous one. So, for example, John Lennon's famous anthem, Imagine. Imagine a world of a certain kind where there is no boundaries, no countries, no religions, no suffering, etc. A brotherhood of man is a classic example of this V level. or the United Nations, which after the tremendous amount of us and them and technology being used in the World War, came up as in response to that to try and find a more harmonious way of dealing with world matters. Or the famous concert for raising money for Africa, which is We Are the World, is another example of this. Another brilliant example of this is the whole Olympic system, which has been running for so many hundreds of years, to say that people can gather together in their nations, in their nation groups, and can compete fairly and can celebrate each other's achievements and push the human race forward in terms of faster, higher, stronger. So when we look at the we level of consciousness, the worldview is that, look, life is rich, diverse, and that this diversity is worth including and is worth celebrating everybody. So from this worldview emerges this thought that differences among us are not to be rejected, but they add depth and value, and that all ways are valid and deserve to be included. So this could be described as a multicultural level. And we see this in many ways, of course. What are the contributions and values at a healthy level? Subjective truths, so not just objective proof, but my opinions, as long as they are inclusive and fair, are to be counted. That this level would value a consensual approach. It would value an egalitarian approach. It would value sensitivity to differences. It would appreciate the feminine. There would be a big dose of compassion. Sustainability would be very important at this level of consciousness. But at the unhealthy level, and remember, every level has its unhealthy side, again, there can be a certain kind of a narcissism. It's a different narcissism from the I level, where it was just me. Now this is a narcissism which is, look at me, I am evolved. There is an element of rejection of any kind of structure and order which has been there in the past. There is this kind of new agey mentality. There is this sense of entitlement that my rights are greater than my responsibilities. And there is also the tendency to relax and let go and be so laissez-faire that you can say anything goes. And we are seeing evidences of this as well. What are some examples? As I said, the United Nations and all multilateral organizations are like this. The great movements of the world, the hippie movement, the environmental movement, the human rights movement, are all examples of this. The whole concept of liberalism and political correctness are an example of this. The field of holistic and integrated medicine, where no one approach is more important than the other, but you want to find a common approach that brings together different systems. The matrix structure, which is not just a top-down, but the fact that you can have horizontal structures as well, and they integrate very well to give you a certain kind of a stability and flexibility for an organization. So I hope again that you're able to see the differences between each of the four levels that we have covered so far, and you can also find in yourself the we level of consciousness. The one, or the unitive level of consciousness. And this is in a way the not only the highest, but also the least known, the least understood, the most neglected, and perhaps the least tangible. So let me try and explain what this level of consciousness is. The worldview here is that all is one and one is all, which means that really there is no separation between any constituent parts, that consciousness infuses and drives and manifests in every aspect of reality. So this worldview is really about wholeness beyond all duality, all polarity, and all separation. And this worldview asks us to constantly be integrating things rather than pulling them apart. Again, when you look at contribution and values, there are many healthy qualities here. For example, this level would, by instinct, take a planetary or a systems orientation. The whole concept of Gaia, which is that the earth is a single living organism. We are its products, and we need to have a certain kind of a harmonious relationship with Mother Earth. This is coming from the one type of a consciousness, the one level of consciousness. The idea of harmonizing conflict, trying to find a healthy balance between science and spirituality, or the concept of practical morality, which is to have high ideals, but to also know how to take those high ideals and put them into day to day practical activities. These are all the healthy sides of this level of consciousness. The unhealthy values, very often you see, is that a certain kind of a superiority can creep in, a certain kind of impracticality can creep in, a certain kind of impatience can creep in, and a certain subtle ego can also creep in. So, paradoxically, while this level of consciousness is furthest away from an egocentric level, the I, this one also has a different kind of an ego in it. So, one has to be really careful. What are some examples of this? We are seeing this slowly emerge in flexible structures, in federal structures, in network structures. And it is also fascinating for me that this level of consciousness may not have been addressed through the academic world or even through the scientific world or even the world of humanities. But in the spiritual world, in the mystical world, this dimension has been known, understood, explored, taught for millennia. For example, even in systems like Christianity, there are branches of it, there are approaches within Christianity which talk about this level of consciousness. Within Buddhism, the Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism is perhaps closest and talks about this a lot. In Hinduism, the systems of Vedanta and yoga are really built around this level of consciousness. And similarly, in the Chinese system, in the Islamic system, and in the Judaic system. So I think that even though this level is not very well known to most of us, if we delve deep into our traditional systems, there is a lot for us to learn. So once again, let me invite you to just reflect and understand the differences between the I, egocentric, the us and them, ethnocentric, the it, scientific, the we, pluralistic, and the one, which is unitive. And to be aware of all these levels of consciousness within us so that we can actually grow consciously and evolve consciously. Now, what's the point of this? And I mentioned earlier, how can we use this to make sense of things that are going on around us? So I'm taking the example of COVID because this has been preoccupying the whole planet and every one of us for the entire year of 2020 and now moving into 2021. So if I were to look at what's happened in COVID, for example, we saw a phase when there was so much panic and that we went out and cleaned out the supermarket shelves, and the thing that we bought a lot of was toilet paper. Now, if you think about the kind of mindset that would have led to such a practice, this would be a classic example of me just thinking about what I need, how I am going to cope, and the hell with everybody else. We can also see that the same COVID then led to a situation where the inequalities in our system between the privileged class, between the affluent class, between the class that was generally well looked after, and those people who are not so well looked after, the marginalized and the disenfranchised class. And we saw these two classes physically separate. The migrants left their area of work because they could not support themselves and actually went back walking hundreds of miles in terrible suffering and discomfort to their villages while we looked after ourselves in our homes in our lockdown. This is an example of the us and them consciousness at work. We can also see the it consciousness at work, the understanding of the COVID-19 virus itself. that it is a protein, it works like this, it has this kind of a life cycle, it responds well to this, it does not respond well to this, which is why the whole thing about wash your hands and keep 6 feet distance and wear a mask and disinfect everything that comes into the house and disinfect surfaces. Then the last 1 year of really looking to find a vaccine. This is completely driven from the it level of consciousness. And at the we level, we have also seen some interesting examples. For example, when we talk about the fact that rivers got cleaned up, the pollution vanished, and suddenly we started feeling like a single planet again. The smog vanished, that we started seeing animals and peacocks on the streets, and suddenly we felt as if nature was coming closer to us and reconnecting with us as a species. And unfortunately, I have to say that when I think about COVID, I haven't seen that many examples of the one or the unitive consciousness at work. So maybe there is hope for us that maybe we can all reach that point someday. But I hope this gives you a chance to see how you can look at any big issue that is going on around you and try and look at it from the lenses of levels of consciousness. Perhaps some of you are asking the question, so what? What can I do? Here is my invitation, and here is my question for all of you. Can you be more present to yourself? Which means, can you be aware of all those levels of consciousness within yourself? Can you be present to which level you're operating from in any situation? And can you pull yourself up as much as possible? Can you be more present to others? Remember, they too have all levels of consciousness within themselves. Can you be present to which level are they operating from and why? What is the stress? What is the challenge that might be impelling them to operate from one level of consciousness than another? Can you be more present to events and situations around you? We know that all levels of consciousness exist simultaneously. Which level is driving things? So if you think about right now what's happening in the US that we're all watching with horror, it is quite clear that at one level, the I of the president, and through that, the us and them of the partisanship is really driving the situation in the US right now. And you can also ask yourself, well, what aspect is being denied? What aspect is being rejected, which is causing this to happen? And ultimately, the challenge for all of us is, can you consciously raise your own consciousness? What are your practices? What is it that you're going to do so that in the future you may be able to influence people and situations by acknowledging and including their healthy values and contributions? Remember that every level has its own healthy values and its own contributions and its own validity and its own legitimacy, and it exists within all of us. So can we be more compassionate and more accepting of it? What next, you might ask? And here is my little suggestion or challenge to all of you. Tomorrow, when you read the newspaper or watch the news, I invite you to select maybe 2 or 3 topics of interest, whatever you find interesting in the newspaper or in the news. And then try to apply these different levels of consciousness to each. See what that looks like from an I level. See what it looks like from an us and them level. See what it looks like from an it level. See what it looks like from a we level. And then see what it looks like from the one level. See what happens when you do that. And please let me know what you feel when you do that. Enjoy. Thank you very much.